Have you ever given thought to life's most subtle temptation? Have you thought about what that might be? Do that right now. I'd like to think about that question today as we continue our study in the life of David, out of 1 Samuel chapter 24. As I read the chapter that describes another instance of David running for his life from the murderous hand of King Saul, take a moment and try to guess what life's most subtle temptation might be, okay? Please turn with me to 1 Samuel 24, beginning at verse 1 and continuing to the end of the chapter. Don't let your mind drift. It's a narrative worth remembering. 1 Samuel 24, 1. Now when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel, and went to seek David and his men in front of the rock of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepfolds on the way, where there was a cave, and Saul went in to relieve himself. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of the cave. The men of David said to him, Behold, this is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I am about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Then David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. It came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. So he said to his men, Far be it from me, because of the Lord, that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. David persuaded his men with these words, and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul arose, left the cave, and went on his way. Now afterward David arose and went out of the cave, and called after Saul, saying, My lord, the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and prostrated himself. David said to Saul, Why do you listen to the words of men, saying, Behold, David seeks to harm you? Behold, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord has given you today into my hand in the cave, and some said to kill you. But my eye had pity on you, and I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Now, my father, see the edge of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the edge of your robe and did not kill you, know and perceive that there is no evil or rebellion in my hands, and I have not sinned against you, though you are lying in wait for my life to take it. May the Lord judge between you and me, and may the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, Out of the wicked comes forth wickedness. But my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog, a single flea? The Lord therefore be judge, and decide between you and me. And may he see and plead my cause, and deliver me from your hand. When David had finished speaking these words to Saul, Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? Then Saul lifted up his voice and wept. He said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have dealt well with me, while I have dealt wickedly with you. You have declared today that you have done good to me, that the Lord delivered me into your hand, and yet you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? May the Lord therefore reward you with good in return for what you have done to me this day. Now, behold, I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hand. So now, swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name after my father's household." And David swore to Saul. And Saul went to his home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. If I had the ability to do something miraculous, I think a scandal would quickly spread in this church. If I could flash on the wall behind me the picture of you this evening who entertain feelings of revenge, it would probably embarrass a number. If I could show you on one side and a doll with pins in it, with the face of your enemy on the other side, we probably would empty the church, or at least almost, as some would be running to the telephone, others would be running out in embarrassment, and maybe a few who have nothing to fear by way of exposure would just enjoy staying right on through this time, because you have learned the secret of vengeance. It's the most subtle temptation in all of life to get even. It might be with an employer who promised you something and didn't come through. It might be with a mate who walked away when you needed him or her the most. It might be with your mom or dad who failed, frankly, and you live today in the backwash. You have been, as it were, done wrong, and you're waiting for the moment to get even. It could be with a friend with whom you trusted some very intimate information, and the friend not only turned against you and revealed it, but is telling lies on you. Or maybe a coach who took you off the first string and benched you with faulty information, and you really are first string material. Or a teacher who refused to hear you out and graded you down. Shall I keep going, or is that enough? We all have our own world, huh? And do you know that unless I miss my guess, in a congregation this size, your inability or ability to handle that trauma will make or break this Christmas. Now, as I put it in the outline, we call this two different things. First of all, we call this my rights, don't we? I have my rights. I'm not a doormat. I refuse to lie down and let him run his tracks over me anymore. I have my rights. If you're a little more educated, you say, this is justified retaliation. That's the other thing we call it, which is saying the same thing as the first. I'm justified in retaliating. I did right. He's done me wrong. I'm going to get back. Now, God calls it vengeance. Let's see what he says about it. Before you look at 1 Samuel 24, check Romans 12, beginning at verse 17. It is nothing more than plain, hardcore revenge. That's what it is. And look at the word that God uses in Romans 12:17, the very first word to describe the times you're to get back. Never. Now, he wrote this, I didn't. Had I written it, it wouldn't be never. It would be usually. But he says never. Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. Now, God doesn't usually in his word give us such extreme statements as never anyone. But he does here. And we're not talking about national defense. We're not talking about defending our shores when the enemy comes. We're not talking about standing up for what is right when such right is ours as a nation. We're talking about a personal offense where evil was done to us and we didn't like it. He says, respect what is right in the sight of all men. And Paul, being a realist, puts it better in verse 18, if possible. So far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. In other words, you can't change the other person. You can handle you through God's power. And he says, if there's to be any blame, leave it with him. Don't you live with it. You do all you can to be at peace. Now, maybe you won't have a track without hurdles. But as far as your path is concerned, nothing stands between you and that person. Then verse 19 says it again. Never take your own revenge, beloved, but leave room for the wrath of God. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. That is what God has written. Everything I have to offer from this message has to do with verses 17, 18, and 19 of Romans 12. And we have a classic case in point with an individual named David who had been wronged by his superior named Saul. Before we look at it, and you can find your way back there to chapter 24 of 1 Samuel, I want to give you the process that we go through in doing revenge. I'll give you 3 words to put down. They kind of have a ring to them. First, injury. Second, vulnerability. Third, depravity. When you mix the 3 together, you get revenge. If you're running the show. I have had a personal offense. I have been hurt individually from another individual. I have personally been injured. All right? In the flesh, I lie in wait for him or her to be in a vulnerable spot. So in that vulnerability, my depravity can go to work and I get back. It's the nature of the beast. You see it in traffic. Right? Saw the most incredible thing this last week. A guy in a brand new Porsche was right in front of me. I was behind him going, you know. And a great big double trailer truck was tooling down along the left lane and cut in front, too close, admittedly, of this Porsche. And this guy driving the Porsche showers down on it. He cuts in front of the truck. That's the dumbest thing I've ever seen in my life. Sacrificing this beautiful car in front of this great big beast that's on the highway. Why'd he do it? Because he has his rights. Now, it goes all the way back to Cain, who brought his offering to God, and God says, I don't accept that. And Cain looked over his brother's shoulder, and God said to Abel, I accept that. And he didn't like that. He was injured. So when his brother was in a vulnerable spot, one-on-one with Cain, he killed him. The Hebrew word is to cut the throat. He cut his brother's throat. He murdered him. That's the nature of the beast. Now, we can sit in this neat place tonight, well-dressed and under control, almost. We can think, wow, that's no problem. I've got a handle on that. And before you're home, it can happen. Where you suffer a personal injury and you wait in the flesh for him to be in a vulnerable spot, and you're going to get in your licks. Unless God takes charge. Now, that's what this passage is all about. Now, don't forget where we've been with David. What a great guy. Somebody did their homework with young David. He was promoted to a place as an officer in the Israeli army. Just before this promotion, he killed a giant. Remember Goliath? Certainly we remember. And the people began to sing his praises. The women in the street sang, Saul has slain his thousands, but David his 10,000s. Saul wasn't a big enough man to watch the man, his junior, promoted above him in popularity, so Saul viewed him with suspicion. Remember what happened? He tried to take his life more than once. And finally, he demoted him from the army. He stripped him of his rank, and David became a fugitive in the wilderness of Judah. He lost his home, lost his wife. He lost his counselor friend. He lost his closest friend, Jonathan, and finally his own self-respect as he dribbled in his beard like a madman in front of the king of Gath. Then he crawled in a cave wanting to die. Just as soon as I finished this message this evening in the first service, a guy came up to me and he says, I just heard the neatest story. Reminded me a little bit about what you were talking about tonight. He said it was about this fellow who had this heavy, heavy pack in life, and he was trudging along with this heavy bag, and the road was rough, and the pack got heavy and heavier, and finally just dropped it down. And he said, I'm ready to die. And suddenly, the death angel appeared and said, did you call for me? And the guy said, yeah, would you help me get this pack back up on my back here? I mean, when you look at the alternatives, it really isn't as bad as you think. Now, David came to the end. David had nothing to look forward to in the cave of Adullam. And of all things, God sent to him 400 malcontents. And David began to give his life to the training of those fellows. And it grew 200 more until there were 600, and they became kind of a band of guerrillas. Kind of in Robin Hood fashion, they became the Mavericks, as we're going to see next time in chapter 25. They sort of maintained right away from the law of the land. And God was preparing David for a new kind of role on the throne of Israel. But all the time, over these years, not months, but years, Saul has been dogging his steps, waiting for his enemy to be vulnerable so he can kill him. I doubt that there are many here, probably safe to say none, that have ever had a contract out in their lives. But David did. And not just from Saul, but the army of Israel was committed to the death of David. If you look at verse 28 of chapter 23, you'll see that they returned from pursuing David, the whole army, 23:28, and went to meet the Philistines. Therefore, they called the place the Rock of Escape. So they came to a place and they realized they got to go back and do battle because the Philistines were moving in. And Saul said, leave off this job. We'll come back to it later. And he went to do the Philistine number. Verse 29, David went up from there and stayed in the strongholds of En-Gedi. Means nothing to us tonight unless you do a little geographical homework. You'll find that En-Gedi is 600 feet above sea level, far above the Dead Sea, and there is what is called a fountain of the goats that pours over its beautiful stream that sort of falls 600 feet and splashes off the rocks and down into the region we know today as the Dead Sea. And to get up to that area, you have to take it very gingerly because the rocks are quite threatening and only the sure-footed animals could make it. Well, David and his men got up into En-Gedi in the strongholds. That's why in the next chapter we read, verse 2, of the rock of the wild goats. Laced in the hillside of En-Gedi are these caves. I read that they are limestone hillsides mixed with flint. And there are cool caves in this upper area, perfect place for camouflage. If you know anything about battle, the higher location is far superior to the lower, and that's where he was, so he could watch out for the army that was looking for him. And here is David, safe and secure in one of the caves in En-Gedi, just checking from day to day with a bountiful water supply. They can eat the animals they kill, so they are supplied with what they need, just safe and secure. Now remember, David has been injured by a madman named Saul who is hunting for him. Now, so much for the situation.
Verse 1, it came about when Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Saul's mind, let's go get him. Verse 3, and he, that Saul, came to the sheepfolds on the way, where there was a cave. Now hang on. And Saul went in to relieve himself. Now, what would you say if you were in my shoes tonight? The Bible is a real book, friends. I read this to one of the staff members, and the response was, I bet David said to him, smile, you're on candid camera. Okay, he answered the call of nature. And Saul found a cave, but not just any cave. Talk about vulnerability. Look at verse 3. Now David and his men were sitting in the inner recesses of that cave. Oh no! Bad enough to be seen, but to be in the cave of the enemy, oh man. Now, if you ever want to test the carnality of man, ask your close friends what you should do when your enemy is vulnerable. Oh, they'll tell you to go for it every time. Unless they're men or women of God. Look at verse 4. The men of David said to him, say, David, this is the day which the Lord said to you. Now, can't you see him in the cave? This is the day which the Lord said to you, I'm about to give your enemy into your hand, and you shall do to him as it seems good to you. Go get him. Hey, let's be real about this business called Bible study. These men had been trained to fight. They knew the truth. They knew that David was innocent. And they knew that if they knocked off the chief, they'd have the Indians. And he's super vulnerable. I mean, he's right there. Go get him, David. You know, this is it. And you know, it's what I call the Lord's will incentive. When we really want to support our idea, we say, the Lord led me to do that. Hey, the Lord gets blamed for all sorts of things he has nothing to do with. They said, hey, David, the Lord's put him right here. Here's a sword. Look at what David did. I love this. David arose and cut off the edge of Saul's robe secretly. Can't you see him? It doesn't say Saul was asleep. He was awake. He was looking out of the cave. And David came up on the blind side, just cut the rope off. Oh man, this is fantastic. Woo! I've got to stop or I'm going to really get in trouble, I'll tell you. Verse 5. Now, this is a beautiful part of David. Oh, he's so real. Man, may God raise up a band of Davids who are going through this series with us. He was troubled. The first thing that happened in this temptation was after he yielded, you know, he could have killed him, but just didn't bring himself to do it. So he cut off part of the robe. Now you say, what's the big deal? Who cares about part of the robe? Just his hem wasn't level from then on. Nobody else could tell it. Who cares if a little bit of the robe? See, that's the way we rationalize. Who cares if you take a little bit from the company? They got so much. Man, they made $800,000 profit last year. They won't miss his few pieces of stationery. I got a friend who really began to walk with God, and he said when I got to the place that I couldn't even take a paper clip, I knew that God had really done business in my life. What belongs to the company doesn't belong to you. And he cut off a part of the garment, and now notice, he began to experience justified guilt. That's the first thing that happened. Verse 5. It came about afterward that David's conscience bothered him because he had cut off the edge of Saul's robe. Oh, why? Just a little piece of linen. Wasn't that color, but that kind of thing. Just a little section of the robe. You see, when you want to really walk with God, you want to come to terms with every detail. That's not nitpicking. You get bothered by little things. Your conscience bothers you when you snap back. Just one statement. You got to make it right. You just can't let yourself get away with it. It's because we get away with it and tell ourselves this doesn't matter that we get in neck deep. David got back and all the guys say, hey, look at that garment. Hey, look, guys, hey. David says, that wasn't right. Hey, I can't do that. It bothered him. Verse 6. Oh, this is courageous. Just put yourself in the shoes of David with the gang at the office or at school. He said to his men, far be it from me because of the Lord that I should do this thing to my superior, to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. I remember all the way through the Marine Corps, they drilled into us, you don't salute the man, you salute the rank. If he is an absolute fool, if he's wasted and he's a major, you salute him because he's a major. Man, David said, that is the king. I haven't any business doing that. So the second thing, he declared a righteous principle. Now, I know where I'm going in this. You hang on tonight because it all relates to this whole business of retaliation. Had he been done wrong? Absolutely. Was Saul in the wrong? Absolutely. Was it David's job to make it right? No, it's God's job. So with a little tantalizing mockery, he operated in the flesh and finally says, that's not right. Boy, there's a righteous principle that I am breaking. Verse 7. I love this. Every once in a while, we see how a man who goes bad brings a whole group with him. Tonight, we see a guy who went right and brought a whole group back with him. Verse 7. David persuaded his men with these words. Look at the margin. Persuaded, tore apart. Hey, that's what the Hebrew word means. It means pierced through, torn apart, ripped up. I have a feeling that they didn't just stand together and mildly say, you think you should have done that? No, I really don't. Well, we'll really consider that, David. No, that dialogue was heated. Don't be a fool, David. Hey, listen, man, this wasn't right. David, the guy's done everything but take your life. Look, I can't do it. And they went back and forth, and he stood for a righteous principle, and they were persuaded. Some of you are hanging in the balance somewhere, maybe in your profession, maybe in the way you've begun to do your business, perhaps in the way you've done your studies or carried on your lifestyle, and you've kind of compromised and you sort of waltzed along on the very thin wire, and you've begun to lean, and God says, you haven't got any business doing that. Get back where you belong. Well, what'll they think? Hey, who knows whom you could persuade if you walked with God? Few things are more infectious than a godly lifestyle. The people in your office need that kind of challenge. Not prudish, not preachy, but I mean crackerjack, clean living, honest to goodness, integrity. I was in a barracks of 48 guys when they dropped me overseas, and our outfit was shot through with venereal disease. I'll never forget the jolt when it hit me. 90% either had or at the time had some kind of venereal disease when I was in Okinawa. I determined before I ever got off the ship, because I knew that in my flesh I was too weak. I couldn't keep from yielding, even though I was a married man. So I said, God, my life is yours. The 18 months I'm on the rock, my life's going to be lived for your glory. You take over. And I'll tell you, I did battle at this. But in a period of time, over an 18-month period, 7 of those guys came to know Christ. Hey, 7 out of 48 in the Marine Corps is a revival. Man. You know what? 7 guys were persuaded, hey, that's a better way to live. Fools live like we've been living. Hey, you don't have to live like that. David said, oh, we can't rise up against Saul. He persuaded the men. So the third thing, it was absolute confidence in God. The temptation came, absolutely it will come, and he wrestled with guilt, which was justified. He hung his life on a righteous principle, and then he stood fast in confidence, absolute confidence in God to make right, even in face of the opposition. Now, you will not hear from counselors. You will not hear from friends to do that, unless your counselor or your friend is doing it God's way. And God's way is, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And that's what David did. Put in the margin of your Bible, if you got a pencil in your hand, Proverbs 27:6. And while you're writing it down, I'll quote it for you. When a man's ways please the Lord, I'm sorry, I said 27. Proverbs 16:7. Good night, 27:6. What is 27:6? Oh yeah, I remember what 27:6. 27:6 is, faithful are the wounds of a friend. Isn't that interesting that would just flash by? Okay, Proverbs 16:7, when a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. Proverbs 16:7, when your ways please the Lord, even your enemies will be at peace. That's a promise. The word easy is not in Proverbs 16:7, by the way. It's not easy. You say, I'm going to live for God, Chuck. I'll say to you in answering, all right, fine, get ready for a battle. Because you're surrounded by people who don't. Even in Christian colleges, even in seminaries, you'll be around individuals that will operate in the flesh. Okay, you can be on the mission field and be surrounded by people in the flesh. Competitive people. People who are out for what they want, selfish people. And the battle is there. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace with him. And that's what happens. The whole balance of this passage has to do with the outworking of that principle. Now, verse 8, look at the conversation. This is so good. Now, afterward, David arose and went out of the cave and called after Saul. Got it? Saul finishes, gets back down, walks down to maybe over a little ravine on the other side, and David chugs out of the cave, got the garment in his hand. Saul, king, verse 8, my lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David bowed with his face to the ground and prostrated himself. And David said to Saul, why do you listen to the words of men, saying, behold, David seeks to harm you? Now wait a minute. David, with the garment in his hand, is talking to Saul. What's he doing? This is very, very important. When you have been wronged, it is necessary for you to declare the truth. You are responsible for declaring the truth to the enemy, whoever the enemy might be. You cannot change your enemy, but you can be sure he's got right input. Some will say, well, that means you're going to lose your reward. No, there is wrong being done against David, just like against some of you. And our tendency is, oh, just leave it alone. It'll all work out. Now, wait a minute. David didn't leave it alone. He was bothered by the garment that he had in his hand, but he didn't just say, Saul, here's your robe back. He said, you're listening to false counsel against me that reveals lies about me. Why do you listen to the words of men? Behold, David seeks to harm you. That's a lie. Verse 10, let me give you verbal proof, Saul. This day your eyes have seen that the Lord had given you today in my hand in the cave. And some said to kill you, but my eye had pity on you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he's the Lord's anointed. He told the truth. And you've got to tell it to the person to whom it matters. Don't tell it to your friends. You've got to come to terms with the individual with whom there is the battle. That's tough. Now, so far it's just verbal proof. Saul could say, you're not any different. Look at verse 11. Now, my father, see, indeed, see the edge of your robe in my hand. And he holds up the garment. For in that I cut off the edge of your robe and did not kill you. Know and perceive there is no evil or rebellion in my hands. I have not sinned against you, though you were lying in wait for my life to take it. May the Lord judge between you and me. Oh, man, that is important. You say he was just dangling his righteousness. No, you know David better than that by now. He's not built like that. A man of integrity, he said, Saul, you're listening to lies. They are not truth. I could have taken your life. I didn't. And as proof, here's the garment. When you were vulnerable, I didn't fight. I didn't strike. May God judge between you and me. Now, Saul's response, I want to read from the Living Bible. Now, you follow along, verse 16. Saul called back, is it really you, my son David? Then Saul began to cry. And he said to David, you are a better man than I am. For you have repaid me good for evil. Yes. You have been wonderfully kind to me today, for when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you didn't kill me. Who else in all the world would let his enemy get away when he had him in his power? May the Lord reward you well for the kindness you have shown me today. Boy. When a man's ways please the Lord, he makes even his enemies to be at peace. Now, wait a minute. Let's come back to reality. This is one case study. I wish I could promise you that when you do what is right, your enemy will, in this way, suddenly see his wrong and turn and repent and view you correctly. But I can't make that kind of promise. Which brings up the second part of what I want to say. You're responsible for telling a person the truth who can do something about it. But it is impossible to make him change his opinion. He may die believing the lie. That's why you can't change depravity. But down inside your heart, you will know the fulfillment of that sense of righteous dealings. Your conscience will be clear. I speak from experience. He confessed, David, you're a better man than I am. I see the whole picture. Now look at verse 20. He recognized David as the next king. Handwriting was on the wall. Behold, I know that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. You're the man, David, not me. And then he asked for a favor. You see, in those days, when an Eastern dynasty was overthrown by the next regime, the new regime would exterminate everyone in the old. And he pled for his family. He said, "Swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's household." And David swore to Saul. Remember Mephibosheth? Does that name mean anything to you tonight? That little crippled fella that was Jonathan's son, who ran for his life and fell and became crippled in both his feet. And the nurse picked him up and carried him to a place called Lodebar. We'll get into it later. And David, when he went to the throne and finally things were moving along, leaned back one day and thought, "Hey, I made a promise to Saul." This is the promise, "that I would do well for his descendants. Is there any man in the house of Saul that I need to remember and be merciful to?" And somebody said, "Well, there's this Mephibosheth." David says, "Go get him." And he went and got him and brought this crippled fellow up to him, scared to death, knees knocking. He knew that was the end. And David put him right at his table, and he ate at the king's table the rest of his life. David fulfilled his promise. But David is wise. Will you notice in closing, Saul went to his home, but David and his men went to the stronghold. That's wise. David didn't go with Saul to his home. He knew Saul too well. Before we're through with this book, you'll see Saul turn again on David. And you see, you get snatches of hope, and suddenly that kind of person that wants to believe a lie will turn on you again and again. You'll get your hopes up, and again he'll believe a lie. Which brings me to 3 very helpful principles to live by when mistreatment happens. Here's the first one. Since man is depraved, expect to be mistreated. Well, how's that for counsel? Everybody ready for a great week? Let's all expect to be mistreated. Well, I'll say one thing, you'll never be let down. We expect too much from depraved manhood. Human individuals who are depraved by nature mistreat. Quit getting your hopes up that tomorrow you're going to meet a depraved person that's going to be great. If a depraved person is great, it's just a momentary break in the rule before he's right back in it again. You know, I have a thing on disappointments. I think we can really live above any other disappointments if we keep our expectation level down. Disappointment is nothing more than a broken expectation. So plan on having a rotten day and you'll never be disappointed. It's terrible counsel, terrible. No, seriously, stop putting so much stock in a depraved person. The same nature that beats in the heart of Saul beats in the heart of every person here, myself included. And when occupied by when we are involved in the flesh, we will respond like Saul. We've talked a lot about being offended. You might be the person tonight that's doing the offense. Now come to terms with it. Call it sin. Since man is depraved, expect mistreatment. Second, since mistreatment is inevitable, anticipate feelings of revenge. Now, word that right. I'm not saying retaliate. I'm saying anticipate the feelings of revenge. It's the nature of the beast. Boy, you could hardly meet anybody that's raunchier than the carnal Christian. By the way, we sure could learn a lot about this if our parents, would do the job in helping us know. it occurred to me that this is a learned trait. Handling mistreatment doesn't come naturally. It would be interesting to me, don't hold your hands up, but just think about it. How many of you had parents that taught you how to handle mistreatment? I would think very few. Dr. Albert Siegel said in the Stanford Observer, this is a very unique approach. When it comes to rearing children, every society is only 20 years away from barbarism. 20 years is all we have to accomplish the task of civilizing the infants who are born into our midst each year. These savages know nothing of our language, our culture, our religion, our values, our customs, our interpersonal relations. These infants are totally ignorant about communism, fascism, democracy, civil liberties, respect, decency, honesty, customs, conventions, and manners. The barbarian must be tamed if civilization is to survive. I got four barbarians. No wonder we're having trouble. This is all part of survival techniques that have to be learned. Who taught you? Probably no one. Life, huh? And you do as you are done to, which is why Jesus' truth is so revolutionary. Do unto them as you would have them do to you, not as they do to you. Rare is the individual who will not retaliate. Rare, rare, rare. Third, you with me? Since man is depraved, expect to be mistreated. Since mistreatment is inevitable, anticipate feelings of revenge. Since revenge is predictable, refuse to fight in the flesh. That's the final picture. That's the final snapshot. That's why David came out on top. His men said, "Go get him, David." He almost did, I'm convinced. But he got there and got cold feet and cut off the robe. And then later, wow, God did his homework. And he said, I can't handle it. And he made it right. I'm sure there are some here living just like that, just waiting till your moment comes. I'd like us to come to terms with that. I'd like you to close your eyes. I'd like you to I'm not going to pray for a few moments. We're going to build an altar. Let's just build an altar right now. I just want you to bow. And I want you to focus right now on that person. Maybe there's more than one. That person that you're just waiting for your moment. If you operated in the flesh, you're going to pin them. You're going to get back. Okay, let's talk to God about that person. Let's call him by name. You follow along. Okay, here we go. Dear God, I acknowledge this moment that Jesus Christ took my sins when he didn't deserve them. And I confess to you that I am resentful of, and you fill in the blank, by name. Even though Jesus died for me and my sins, I am holding against, name the person, the treatment he or she is giving to me. please forgive me. Tonight I ask you to free me from this bondage and to keep me from it for the rest of my life. I claim God's power through Jesus Christ, my Lord. Heavenly Father, at this time of year when the beauty of the season is upon us, there is healing that needs to take place so the beauty can be appreciated. Forgive us for excusing and rationalizing around this deep taproot of bitterness. Expose it tonight in all its ugliness and put it to death. Thank you for Jesus Christ who went through hell for us and gives us the power that we need to overcome the worst kind of condition in our lives. Because this is a learned trait, help us to grow in the process that we might live above the bondage. I pray through Christ. Amen.
The preceding message, Life's Most Subtle Temptation, was copyrighted in 1977, 1988, 1997, and 2009, and the sound recording was copyrighted in 2009 by Charles R. Swindoll, Inc. All rights are reserved worldwide. Duplication of copyrighted material for commercial use is strictly prohibited.